Good morning, good morning. It is October 17th. This is a Monday. This is episode 25. And this is also the only podcast broadcast from a parking lot running through my mind with Don the Idea Guy from dontheideaguy.com. My solo one-man show to kind of just ramble on about, whatever is running through my mind today. That's kind of where the show got its name. As we're starting a new Monday, I got a couple things going on. One, it is a new week, so there's projects to revisit that I left to their lists on Friday when I broke for the weekend. And then there are projects that are coming to a conclusion. I will be able to remove them from my to-do list over the next couple of weeks, which is kind of nice because I've been working on them. They're going to come to a fruitful conclusion. I think they're going to come out just fine. The audience, as always, is the judge. But I'm going to have room on my to-do list for a couple more projects to move in kind of from the waiting list into the active list. And I wanted to talk about that process. I was listening to my friend Ozeal's No Permission Needed podcast on the way to work. It was a good episode where he actually did a solo episode. He's got great interviews, but he had a solo episode where he was kind of running down his list of things that needed done in his world to level up his life. And I think that's what the stack list is, right? That's the waiting list of the things that you need to do when you're done with client projects or active projects. And you can only take a couple of those to work on at a time, because if you work only on your stuff, you won't get any client work done. I have heard people refer to their task list, making sure the important things in life are done, as the rocks in the jar. Have you heard that too? The big rocks, taking care of the big rocks first, putting in the big rocks first. If you go to YouTube and just search for big rocks first, I'm sure you'll find 100 different videos of people explaining this concept. I'll explain it briefly here, but I'll link up a video in the show notes. Basically, a professor was asking the students, how they made room in their life for so many things, and he would put things in this jar and ask them if there was still room. So he took out several rocks and he put them in the jar, and then he asked if the jar was full, and the student said yes, and he brings out pebbles and he pours the pebbles in, and they filled up the spaces around the big rocks that were in the jar. And he said, now is the jar full? And the student said, oh yeah, they couldn't possibly fit any more stuff in that jar. And he pulls out sand and he pours the sand around the pebbles and around the larger rocks and fills it up to the top. And now you've got the big rocks, the pebbles, and the sand. And he asks, now is the jar full? And the students figure there's no way that you can fit anything else in this jar. And they say, yes, the jar is full. And then he pulls out water and pours the water into the jar. And the water, being a liquid, just soaks into the sand and fills up every last ounce of space in the jar. And now the jar is filled. But the trick is, the professor tells them, that you have to put the big rocks in first, because if you fill the jar with sand first, you won't be able to fit in the big rocks. If you fill it with pebbles, you won't be able to fit in the big rocks. If you put in the water first and then try and put the big rocks in, the water will splash out. So it was a metaphor for make sure that you're working on the most important things, the big rocks in your life, before you move on to the smaller and more menial things. My conversation with you today is based on where do the big rocks come from. And I think that we all have this mountain of things that we want to work on, that we think we should be working on, that we need to work on. And the big rocks come from that mountain. So when there is room in the jar, as in the case where I've got a presentation I'm giving tomorrow night, that's going to be a big rock that I remove from my jar, it's going to leave room for another big rock. So I'm going to take the giant sledgehammer and chip something off of the giant mountain of things that I want to get done and I need to get done and I'd like to get done. And I'm going to put that big rock into my jar because now I've got a new big rock. So you have to remember that although you're putting the big rocks in the jar, eventually you're going to be taking some of those big rocks out and you need to replace them. So that's your waiting list, right? Your rock pile of things. They're big rocks and you put them in the stack, and either you can take them whole and put them into your jar, depending how big your jar is, or you're going to need to whack them with a sledgehammer and break them apart and then put them in the jar. That's also how you fit in the pebbles and the sand around your big rocks in your jar. Because every one of those big rocks can be broken down into smaller tasks. Every one of those big rocks is made up of smaller rocks. You need to find the break lines so that you can hit it and it'll break into smaller pieces. Those smaller pieces become the tasks that add up to that big rock. So you may have a big rock, which is redesign your website. Yeah, that's a big rock for me. But right now there's not room in my jar for it. My current website works okay. I know it needs updated. I'd like it to be updated, but it's got the right feel for what I want, but it's not as mobile friendly as it should be. It doesn't have the page building capabilities I'd like to add in there. There's some other elements I'd like to build into a new site. But I don't have time to just put the big rock of building the new site into my jar right now. But I can take that big rock and break it down into some smaller rocks, some smaller pebbles that are the tasks required to add up to that big rock. So for instance, I can be looking at new color schemes for the site. I've started looking at what would be the best content to put on that site. I really want to promote myself for some more speaking gigs. I love speaking. Well, my site is set up as a creative consultant and not as much as a speaker. So I'm talking to people who book speakers. I'm talking to speakers who get more business than I do. And I'm asking them, what goes into a good speaker site, so that when I'm ready to put the big rock in my jar, I will have crossed off a lot of the small rocks, the small pebbles that add up to it, so I'm better prepared to work on that big rock. I'm looking at WordPress themes that I think might be a good candidate for the new Don the Idea Guy website. I'm looking at new plugins that I think could work better for setting appointments and scheduling events and putting together event calendars. I'm looking at new podcast pieces. Podcasting has become an important piece to me. I love this solo podcast, but I've got 2 or 3 people that I plan to launch podcasts with in the next 3 to 6 months, and I want to make sure I've got a good player on the website to share those. New photos. I love the photos I have on the website of me and the giant light bulb. I love those. But I'm looking in the mirror the other day, and I've got a lot more gray hair on my head than I do in those photos. And while my smirk is the same, the hair's not. So I either need to retouch those photos with some gray Photoshop airbrushing, or I need to get some new photos taken. So there's a ton of little pieces that go into the big rock, right? And you've got a mountain of things that you need to do, and it seems insurmountable. Even when you break them into the large rocks, you chip away at the giant mountain and you come away with boulders. You can't really fit a boulder into your jar. You need to break that boulder into big rocks, and then you need to break those big rocks into pebbles, into gravel. Grind it into sand to figure out that daily thing that you can do that moves you one step closer to your goal, 1 grain closer to your goal. But you put it in the jar so you can get it done and your focus is on it. There's an app out there, and I'm not going to remember the name of it right now, but I will link it up in the show notes. And there are plenty of to-do lists out there, and I think it's important that you put a master list together of all the things you do. It is absolutely important to put together the master list. But it's also important to put together the daily list, just the things you're going to focus on for that day, just the things you're going to focus on for that hour maybe. The really big rocks, right? And like the jar, you can only fit 3 or 4 big rocks into that jar, the things you're going to focus on. Maybe you fill up your jar every day and you choose new rocks to focus on every day. That's you and your process. But you need to choose those rocks. You need to choose them carefully. So there's a neat app out there that I found. Again, I'll link it up in the show notes. But it only allows you to put 4 things to focus on. There's one primary item, and that box is really big. So you put the primary item in that box. And then there are 3 smaller ones. The other things that you'll focus on is that large project gets moved to the side, gets accomplished. And I like that. The idea of just putting together your list of just the 4 things for the day. Just the 3 things for the day. You should try it. Those 3 things can come from your mountain. They can come from your jar of rocks. They can come from the pebbles. But it's important to make steady progress. Otherwise, the mountain just keeps getting bigger. If you never put any of those in the jar, if you never break those down into smaller pieces, the mountain just keeps getting bigger. And pretty soon you'll be buried in an avalanche of the things that you wanted to do, instead of you climbing the mountain and achieving, that peak performance by reaching the top. That's it for the day. I will talk to you again tomorrow for another episode of Running Through My Mind. Be sure to visit me at dontheideaguy.com. You can visit the podcast page at Spreaker by going to dontheideaguy.com/mind, M-I-D. I'd love it if you left a review there or on iTunes. Again, we've hit episode 25 now. I'd love to get some feedback from you guys on what you're loving and hating. Leave an honest review. I'd love 4 stars. Hey, man, everybody loves the top rating. But I'll settle for any kind of feedback from you. Hopefully, if it's a 1 star, you'll email me directly and tell me what you hate about the show, or maybe it's just not the show for you, but I'll pick an honest review over anything else. But leave feedback. Leave a comment. Reach out and connect with me. Let me know what you love, hate, or like to hear more about. On Running Through My Mind with Don the Idea Guy. I'll be back on Tuesday for episode 26. Make it a great one. Go break some rocks.